Hello, everyone. Greetings. My name is Tim Kais, and I am the host of God Save the King. As usual, you can listen to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And of course, there are a variety of ways that you can listen to the Truth Be Told radio network, whether it's my show or any of the other great shows that are on the Truth Be Told network. You can, of course, go to truthbetoldnetwork.org and click on the big listen button. And of course, you can listen on Alexa and Google and Apple home devices where you can just say, hey, Alexa, play Truth Be Told radio network and listen to God Save the King and any of the other shows on Truth Be Told radio network. So let's jump into it right now because it is, quote unquote, that time of year. It is that time of year where we traditionally celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. And if you've listened to any of my shows before, you've heard me, very, very much, very clearly say that, Jesus wasn't born on December 25th. And this really brings up a conundrum for us, which is how do we handle the fact? How do we handle the fact that he wasn't born on December 25th? Because the traditions, and that's exactly what they are, the traditions are so ingrained in our collective psyche that frankly, and and I'm just going to be blunt here, that frankly, a lot of people, it's like, you are killing their most sacred cow imaginable, that you're saying, well, no, wait a second, he wasn't born on December 25th, which also means, unfortunately, that a lot of the practices that we have, I'm going to be kind, do my best to be gracious here, that makes it questionable whether they really honor God or not. Because, Jesus on several occasions in the Gospels railed against the Pharisees for telling them that their traditions, right? Their traditions, that's a scary word, that they exalted their traditions so much that they actually wound up contradicting the very commandments that they thought they were upholding, right? I mean, am I not right? Didn't Jesus do that on several occasions with the Pharisees where he didn't pull any punches? He said, the traditions of men, I'm sorry, they don't count. They don't count. And therefore, the question we really have to ask ourselves is Christmas and associating the birth of Christ with Christmas, does that fall into that category, right? Does this become the traditions of men? And are we legitimately and genuinely honoring God by celebrating the birth of Christ at a time when it didn't happen? Not to mention the fact that celebrating his birth is not mentioned in the Bible. It's not there, right? The fact of his birth is mentioned, and the fact that, the shepherds showed up was a big deal. The fact that angels showed up was a big deal. The fact that the Magi showed up 15 months later is a big deal. And yet there is no explicit or even implicit commandment that we are supposed to honor Christ by celebrating his birthday, right? Very interesting. So let's talk about this because I've mentioned this before. I'm going to mention it again because it's just so appropriate, right? In Peter Jackson's film treatment of the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien, there is a great summary statement made by the Lady Galadriel as she narrates the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring. Okay. Now, this may or may not be a direct quote from the books. And if it is in one of the books, I don't know which one it is because I read them so long ago. And then also, Peter Jackson very freely included components of the Silmarillion in his treatment of the story. But that doesn't really matter here. This is just really a great statement because they're talking about, the ring and the history of the ring, and that the history of the ring is important. And there are things. See, what we're driving at here is that there are things that are important enough to be remembered. See, the Bible is very clear about that. And that's not the same necessarily as a tradition, right? So, for example, when God so here you go. Let's just go right for the throat, right? So God, via Moses, leads the children of Israel out of captivity in Egypt. Okay. He brings the plagues, the 10 plagues against Egypt. And then he tells the children of Israel that they are to slaughter a lamb, to strike its blood upon the doorpost and lintels, and then go into the house where they eat a solemn but celebratory meal of the roasted lamb, etc., etc. And that because they are inside, when God sends the angel of death and sees the blood on the doorposts and lintels, that the angel of death will pass by, will pass over, okay, and will not touch anyone in the house, right? And so then that is a critical component in Pharaoh's release of the children of Israel. And then they go out into the desert, and then they go to Mount Sinai, and then they wander in the desert for 40 years, and then they eventually come into the promised land. But God tells them explicitly, okay, this is explicit, you can't get away from this, that God explicitly tells them to commemorate every year the celebration of the Passover. And it is the first of 7 festivals that the Jews celebrate every year. It's up of the 7 Mosaic festivals, right? There's 2 more that have been added that are non-Mosaic festivals, Hanukkah and Purim, okay? But it is the first of the 7 Mosaic festivals that they are commanded to keep, clearly and explicitly commanded to keep. And that the reason, frankly, is so that they never forget, right? They never forget. That's the idea, right? Then, if you fast forward all the way up to Jesus' earthly ministry, and right before his sacrificial death, he celebrates the last Passover. Now, that's a much better title than Last Supper. He celebrates the last Passover with his disciples. And during that last Passover, he changes the commemorative practice to what we now would refer to as the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion, where it says that he, broke bread and had them eat of the bread and told them that this is his body, and then had them drink wine and symbolically declared, this is my shed blood, right? And then when you get into the New Testament proper and the church epistles, Paul instructs us that we are to celebrate the Lord's death, and by implication, his resurrection and ascension, by celebrating Holy Communion, and that by doing so, we proclaim his death until he comes again. Now, these are explicit and these are right there, okay? The Jews were told you celebrate Passover so that you don't forget, what God did for you. And then Paul is saying really essentially the same thing. We now celebrate the Lord's Supper, Holy Communion, so that we don't forget what Christ did for us by his substitutionary death and resurrection and then ascension, and the fact that this paves the way for the new life, the new creation, the resurrected life until he comes again, right? So a truly critical component of this understanding is so that we do not forget. And that is the true meaning of a ritual or of a quote unquote tradition. Okay. It's that so we don't forget. And it's so that we don't forget something important. It's so that we do not forget something important, right? I'm repeating myself here because it's just, it is. I'm going to say it again. It's important. All right. So now, finally, getting back to this quote made by the Lady Galadriel as she narrates the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, the movie by Peter Jackson, not necessarily the book, right? And I've adapted this. I'm reading it as two sentences, and the two sentences are actually inverted when she says it in the movie. But it goes like this: history became legend, legend became myth, and some things that should not have been forgotten were lost. Okay. Things that should not be forgotten. See, there it is. Things that are important and things that should not be forgotten. Things that should not have been forgotten were lost. And I'm here to tell you today that the real nativity story has been lost because it's been replaced by Christian mythology, what we would commonly refer to as the traditional nativity story. And the traditional nativity story, as we are so used to, is some slight variation on Joseph and Mary, with Joseph leading a donkey and Mary riding the donkey, frankly, in labor, right? Arrive in Bethlehem for the taxation or the census. Now, it's true, they definitely traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem. There's no question about that. But they arrive in Bethlehem. In the traditional story, they usually pull in, late in the day at dusk, right? Or maybe even later, and they go to the innkeeper of the local inn, the local motel, and they request a room. And then the innkeeper rejects them and says, no, there's no room in the inn, but there's a stable right out back. If you want to use that, hey, I'm sorry, it's not very pleasant, but at least you're going to have some type of shelter on quote unquote a cold winter's night. See, that's assuming a December 25th birth. Okay. And then, of course, Mary gives birth within hours of approaching on the back of a donkey in labor, which makes no sense whatsoever. And she delivers apparently in a stable, right? And then we presume, because of scripture, that Jesus is then laid in a manger, which we, according to our Western understanding, we think that means it's a wooden feeding trough that would be found in a stable, and that's not entirely illogical, because in Western culture, that is what you would find. You sometimes, not always, but sometimes you would legitimately find that in Western culture. But as I have talked about in other shows, that's not what you find in Eastern culture. So at any rate, she gives birth. They clean him up and they wrap him in swaddling clothes, of course, right? So, and now, of course, nearby, in fields nearby, the shepherds are watching their flock at night. Once again, presumably in the winter, which we know that according to how things worked in the ancient Near East with shepherds, that they did not watch their flocks in open fields during the winter. Okay, which is what it says. It tells us very clearly in the Gospel of Luke that nearby there were shepherds abiding in the fields, watching their flocks by night. And that is actually a glaring sign telling us that it's not the winter, because in the winter they were not in open field. Shepherds still watch their flocks in winter. They had to, but they put them in sheepfolds. Okay. But at any rate, this is going on nearby. And then, of course, we discover that angels appear to the shepherds, announcing that the newborn king of the Jews is here. He has finally arrived. The Messiah is here. And of course, then the shepherds take off and they go to Bethlehem and they find the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. And then, according to the traditional nativity story, then the Magi show up the same night. Okay. And then they all sing a Christmas carol together, right? Obviously, that's how it goes. So that's the traditional story. Joseph and Mary, back of a donkey, arrive at dusk, turned away by the innkeeper. She gives birth in a stable. Meanwhile, shepherds have angels appear to them. They rush to the stable where they find the baby, and then the Magi show up, and then that's the end of the traditional story. But the problem with that is great, big, huge, enormous chunks of that are not accurate biblically, or frankly, historically, or frankly, according to just common sense. Just that simple. You don't put a 9-month pregnant woman on the back of a donkey. Now, did Mary ride a donkey? It's possible that she did, because I think they actually they actually left Bethlehem when Mary was no more than about 4 months pregnant, because scripture plainly tells us that while they were there, her time came about that she should be delivered. The time came about, right? So she didn't arrive hours or even days before she delivered. She arrived at least weeks, if not months, before her delivery date. Okay. So maybe she rode a donkey, maybe she didn't, but I guarantee she didn't ride one at 9 months pregnant. Okay. And they didn't arrive with her 9 months pregnant. So that's not correct. Also, as we have discussed in other episodes, it's not a motel. It's a traditional Judean home, because if you understand Judean architecture, they would keep their household animals in the house with them, and that the manger that, according to Western culture, would be in a stable is actually in the house. It's in the living room, and it's made out of stone. It's not made out of wood. So it's a very different mind picture. But they were not rejected by an innkeeper. That didn't happen. Okay. There's no innkeeper in the story, and there's no inn. There's no motel in the story. There is a guest room in the story, right? So the likelihood that Jesus was born surrounded by family, by Joseph and Mary and their at least extended family, is very high, very, very high, and that there would have been midwives and the whole thing, right? And then now, yes, the angels did appear to shepherds, and the shepherds showed up, and the shepherds found the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. Now that's accurate, right? But once again, the manger is not in a stable. The manger is in the living room of a traditional Judean home. And then, of course, we've talked about this extensively in other episodes. The Magi did not arrive that night. They arrived about 15 months later. So the point being here is that that's a lot of error. That's not a small amount. I'm really sorry, and I know there's going to be a lot of people that disagree with me, and I'm going to be very unpopular for saying something like this, but those are not differences that are small enough that we can ignore them and say, oh, God understands. God looks upon the heart, and my heart is pure because I'm celebrating the birth of Jesus. Well, I'm glad God looks upon the heart, and that he gets to judge that and not me, because I'm not so sure that's going to work out the way some people think it's going to work out, right? Because it's very hard for the heart to rejoice in what the mind recognizes as untrue, right? And those just things that they're just not accurate. It's not the right day, right? And not a stable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then when we do plug in the correct story, see, that's the flip side. It's not enough that the traditional story is incorrect. It's that when we substitute, and it's not substitute, that's not the right word, forgive me. When we tell story, the real story of Joseph and Mary and their nuptials, right? Their betrothal and nuptials, and that we place that in the context of a Jewish wedding, and then they're traveling to Bethlehem for the registration and the oath of allegiance to Augustus Caesar because they were of the house of David. They were from the royal family. Now, yes, they lived as commoners, make no mistake. Nazareth was a small village. Bethlehem was not much different, and they were under confiscatory taxes by Herod. So they definitely lived as commoners, but that doesn't change the fact that Joseph and Mary were royals. They were royals. They were of the royal family. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, their presence there would have been celebrated. Okay, they would have been quote unquote celebrities to a degree. So if they did not stay with family, they at the very least would have been welcomed into any home in Bethlehem because they were of the house of David and were traveling to their ancestral hometown, okay, for the registration. So the point here is that the traditional nativity story is strongly associated with the holiday that we call Christmas, right? Now, so to hundreds of millions of people, both Christian and non-Christian, believer and unbeliever, okay, Christmas and the birth of Christ are, they're synonymous. They're the same, they're identical. But the problem is that simply is not true. And as a matter of fact, what most of us think we know about the birth of Christ tends to come from these Christmas sources, right? Christmas cards, Christmas carols, manger scenes, and of course, the ubiquitous children's Christmas pageant with its live manger scene, as opposed to unbiased investigative research into what the nativity really would have looked like. So the association between Jesus' birth and Christmas is really a non-starter. They really have absolutely nothing to do with each other. That is how great the distinction is. And that's what concerns me, frankly, about our traditions, is that if something important is not to be forgotten, and we are substituting what is now clearly Christian mythology, right? Not an accurate story about his birth. Are we really truly honoring Christ and God the Father by doing that, right? Okay. See, and so the question before us today is, well, then how did we get this tradition? And we're going to talk about that here in a minute, but I want to emphasize something else before we get into the history of where did the tradition come from? Where did we go astray? How did history become legend and legend become myth, and then things that should not have been forgotten were lost? How did that happen? Right? Because the tradition, right, of connecting Jesus with Christmas, right, that developed over time. It didn't happen all at once. It developed over time. And so, how does that happen, right? So much of what we know of and then what happens is that the tradition develops over time, right? But then eventually you get to the point where it's accepted, right? Where at least the majority accepts it. So then certain language, certain vernacular, certain lingo becomes acceptable, right? And we believe that it's true. So then when you use a phrase, something like the Christmas story, right? See, and I try, and it's funny because, I was raised that way too. I was raised just like everybody else. And this is how ingrained it is in our collective psyche that I still find myself occasionally slipping and saying the Christmas story, right? Instead of saying the nativity story, right? And I've gone to great lengths to call it the traditional nativity story versus the real nativity story. But it's so ingrained in our collective psyche, and it is there's so much emotion tied to it that it's very, very difficult for people to let go of that sometimes because they're just so attached to it. But at any rate, my point here is that we use phrases like the first Christmas. Well, that's just not right. See, and I understand we do it unknowingly. We do it very unknowingly, but that implies a fact about the nativity that isn't true, right? It's not the Christmas story. Christmas, and ironically, the history of Christmas. See, and I said earlier, the traditional nativity story is strongly associated with the holiday we call Christmas. Ironically, the traditional nativity story has its history of its own, and then the holiday known as Christmas also has a history of its own. And they, for a short time, not for very long, those two traditions developed independent of one another. And actually, a better way to say it is this: is that they at times those traditions developed independent of one another, and then at times those two traditions became interwoven and became syncretized with each other, and therefore developed, in kind of an intertwined fashion. So at times they developed parallel but distinct, and then times they developed interdependent of each other. So now when we use phrases like the Christmas story, or God forbid, the first Christmas, that one just grinds my gears, right? When I hear someone say with the first Christmas, right? Well, it wasn't called Christmas for several hundred years after Jesus was born. It wasn't called that, right? So when you call it the first Christmas, that is this twisted form of reverse engineering, that what we're doing is that we're assuming what is going on today, or 100 years ago, or 200 or 500 or 1,000 years ago. We're assuming that that is correct, and we're looking backwards through that viewfinder to the birth of Christ 2,000 years ago, and attaching to the birth of Christ things that we find in this Christmas viewfinder, right? And that's what we're doing. So it winds up coloring our understanding of the nativity. And so finally, let me get to this point. See, and I know I'm going to be very unpopular for this. People are not going to like me when they hear me say this, okay? The nativity is not a Christian story. It's not. It's not a Christian story. It is Christian mythology, but it's not even the real nativity story is not a Christian story, because Joseph and Mary weren't Christians. Joseph and Mary were Jews. The nativity story is a Jewish story. And it's precisely because we have removed the Jewishness of the story that we miss so many details that make the story really, truly come alive, right? Joseph and Mary were Jews, and everything they would have done would have attested to that fact. And frankly, we know, but we don't know this for absolute certain, but it is highly probable that Joseph and Mary's families migrated from Judea, which is in the southern portion of the nation of Israel, and that they migrated from the southern portion of Israel in and around Jerusalem, the tribal allotment to Judah, and that they traveled to the north to Galilee, okay, either during or shortly after the reign of Aristobulus, one of the Hasmonean rulers of the kingdom of Judea, because the Hasmoneans were devoted to restoring the Jewish history of of the nation, of the kingdom of Judea, right? As a matter of fact, there's a pretty stunning a pretty stunning contrast between the holiday that we call Christmas and the holiday called Hanukkah, which I'll get to in just a second, because see, Hanukkah is what enabled the house of Hasmon to rule Israel. Hanukkah is what set that up. But let me finish my previous point, and then we'll talk about that in just a second here. So, Joseph and Mary were Jews. And like I said, everything they would have done would have attested to that fact. Joseph's family was Jewish, Mary's family was Jewish. They most likely migrated to Galilee from Judea, their families did, probably about 100 years before Jesus was born, in a specific and deliberate attempt to re-Judaize Galilee, right? And this, in effect, and there's going to be a lot of people that aren't going to like this, Joseph and Mary were, the word we would use is that they were patriots. They were patriots. They were devoted to the correct history of the Messiah coming from the tribe of Judah and the house of David. They were looking forward to the day and time. See, because it's emphasized. We are told in the narrative that Joseph is from the house of David. We're not told directly that Mary is, but if you do your homework and read between the lines, it's very, very clear that she was also from the house of David. All you have to do is read her genealogy, which we're going to talk about that here in a minute. Okay, is that Mary's genealogy is clearly the genealogy of someone from the house of Judah. So anyway, let me finally finish this point, right? Joseph and Mary were Jewish. Everything they would have done would have attested to that fact. Joseph's family was Jewish. Mary's family was Jewish. They were traveling to their ancestral hometown because they were descended from Jewish royalty. And the birth of Jesus takes place on a Jewish holy day. Okay? Joseph and Mary's betrothal and marriage, the betrothal and the nuptials, were a patently Jewish event. They were not some, oh my God, I'm trying to think of the right word here without being irreverent. And that is because we're going to talk about where the tradition came from. And that record of how Joseph and Mary were married is patently ridiculous. It is. It's just absolutely patently ridiculous. There's no way it would have gone down like that. Joseph and Mary were Jews. They were Jews, okay? And the traditional story, see, which we're going to get into here in a minute, is from demonstrably false extra biblical sources and traditions that therefore, in effect, turn it into Christian mythology. And it is Christian mythology, here you go, this is critical, that repeatedly and consistently violates, distorts, and ignores Jewish laws and customs. And that is extremely important because, like I keep saying, I'm beating this thing to death. Joseph and Mary were Jews. Joseph and Mary were Jews. And everything they would have done would have been Jewish in nature. So whenever we run into something in the traditional nativity story that doesn't have that Jewish flavor to it, you can pretty much guarantee that it's not correct. If it smells wrong, to a Jew, then you know it's not right. You know it's not right, okay? And that's a real problem. So, where did this tradition come from? How did this wrong thinking even enter into the picture? Well, we can actually trace the origin of many of the components found in the traditional nativity story to what are known as the infancy gospels. Okay. Now, there's a small handful of them, there's more than one, but the one that is the most well known and is probably the most influential is known as the Protoevangelium of James. It's also known as the Gospel of James. It's also known as the Infancy Gospel of James. But to make sure we are talking about the right document here, I usually emphasize that it's often called the Protoevangelium of James. And of course, this has nothing to do with the Epistle of James found in the Bible. They are not interconnected in any way, shape, or form other than by lies and falsehood. Okay. Because at the end, actually, yeah, it's at the end. So if you read the Proto-Evangelium of James, and it's not a very long document. You can read the entire thing in about, depending on how fast of a reader you are, 10 to 20 minutes. It doesn't take very long at all. Okay. But when you get to verse quote unquote 24, because that's it, it's 24 paragraphs. That's it. It's all the longer it is. And when you get to the 24th or 25th paragraph, the 24th verse, quote unquote, it's the very end. It's the very end of the document. It reads, "And I, James, that wrote this history in Jerusalem, a commotion having arisen when Herod died, withdrew myself to the wilderness until the commotion in Jerusalem ceased, glorifying the Lord God, who had given me the gift and the wisdom to write this history. And grace shall be with them that fear our Lord Jesus Christ, to whom be glory to ages and ages. Amen." Okay, so that's the final verse of the Protoevangelium of James. Now, here's the problem. We can take the language used in James and compare it to how language was used in the early first century, the late first century, the early second century, the mid second century, and the late second century. And we can date roughly when this was written. And it was not written during the lifetime of James, the Lord's brother. It was not. It could not have been. This was written much later. It was probably written around 200 AD. Okay. And 200 years is way more than enough time, 170 years since Jesus' earthly ministry. That's way more than enough time for error to creep in. So you can already see where I'm going with this. This is where the problems jump up. And I, James, that wrote this history in Jerusalem. Two lies in one half of a sentence. It's not written by James, and he wasn't in Jerusalem when he wrote it. Because when you read the document, it describes geophysical features of Jerusalem and the surrounding area that we know are not accurate. The man or woman, it's possible, the man or woman who wrote this document most likely was never in Jerusalem. So you've got real problems real fast, right? It was not written by James, the Lord's brother, and it was not written from Jerusalem. It's really very, very obvious that those two things are not true. So what is this document, right? So this document is what is known as it's called pseudepigrapha, right? It's a fancy word, okay, that means a document that is falsely ascribed to a famous historical figure. So pseudo, right? which means false or fake, right? Pseudo, epigrapha, and epigrapha means like ascription, writing or ascription. See, so it's falsely ascribed to someone who did not write it. Okay, so right there, even before we get into an analysis of the book, right? Even before we get into a really thorough analysis of the book, we've already got a huge problem because we know that this book is pseudepigraphal, right? So, and now, just so for the sake of argument, let me mention this very quickly. There's also another type of falsely ascribed book that is called apocrypha or apocryphal, right? So it's similar in many ways. Apo means off or away from, right? And then the apo apocryphal, the cryphal part comes from the word cryptine, which means to hide, right? So in other words, an apocryphal book tends to mean it's got something hidden or something secret, right? And there are a small handful, and it's only a small handful of apocryphal books or pseudepigraphal books that we should pay any reasonable attention to, because they sometimes will actually record some historical facts that are accurate. This is not the case with the Protoevangelium of James. The Protoevangelium of James is so chock full of errors and mistakes, and most likely, I hate to say this, out and out lies, that there is no reason that we should believe any of it. Even the most benign fact cannot be trusted from the Protoevangelium of James, because there's a couple facts in there that, okay, they might be true. It's totally possible they might be true, and at the end of the day, they don't really matter all that much. Okay, like one thing it mentions is in the Protoevangelium of James is that Mary was 16 when she gave birth. Right, now that's possible. That's entirely possible, but we don't know that. The likelihood that she was a teenager is pretty good, right? But she very easily could have been 19. We don't know for sure exactly how old Mary was, but we get this notion that she was a young teenager or a mid teenager from the Protoevangelium of James. Now, before I get into other facts that are in the POJ, okay, the Protoevangelium of James, the POJ, let me mention a couple things about it, because it was written in approximately 200 AD. Okay, the history of the Protoevangelium now is it very quickly came under fire as being specious, right? Pope Innocent the First condemned it, okay, and said that it, and in a decree, right, in what's known as the Galatian decree, he said that the POJ, the Protoevangelium of James, was among the apocryphal books that was supposed to be avoided by believing Christians. Avoid it, right? So this is one of the early popes said, nope, no good. Nope, don't believe a word of it, right? The very famous theologian Thomas Aquinas, he wrote in his very famous Summa Theologica, he called it apocryphal ravings. He thought it was nonsense as well. But despite both official and scholastic condemnation, okay, official and scholastic condemnation of the Protoevangelium, it became widely popular on through the Renaissance, right? And which it's amazing, because it cannot be too strongly emphasized that this is a fictitious work written by someone who, pardon me, wanted to look good, right? Wanted to come off as being James, the Lord's brother, wanted to come off as being an authority, wants to come off as having written this from Jerusalem, when quite clearly in the record itself, he was never near Jerusalem, right? Because, and he wasn't Jewish, by the way. Whoever wrote this was not Jewish, because he, once again, and I made this statement a little while ago, the violation of Jewish commandments, laws, and traditions, and I use the word tradition there in a more generic sense, but the violation of Jewish traditions is pretty extreme, right? So here is a short list. This isn't a complete list by a long shot. This is a short list of facts that are from the Protoevangelium of James. This is where they came from. We can trace them back to this source, okay? So Joseph and Mary's parents in the Protoevangelium are said to live in and around Jerusalem. Well, when we're introduced to Mary in the Gospels, she's from Nazareth. So the likelihood that, now, is that impossible? No, not necessarily. But is it likely? No. Is it reasonable? No, because it contradicts the Bible, right? We are in the Protoevangelium, we are given Mary's parents' names. Okay, we are told they that her father's name is Joachim or Joachim, right? And Anna, right? And there's no reason for us to believe that that is true, because we are actually given Mary's father's name in the Bible. Now, you have to do a significant amount of digging to figure that out, right? It's not easy. And frankly, a lot of people are going to look at me and say, Tim, you're stretching it there, but that's not actually the case. This is pretty self-evident once you know what you are looking for, okay? Because so you have two genealogies of Jesus. You've got one in Matthew, and then you've got another in Luke, okay? Two different genealogies, and they don't read the same. And there has been a lot of confusion about which of these genealogy is correct, because you can't really sort them out necessarily, right? But the point here is that the gospel in Matthew, the genealogy in Matthew is Jesus's genealogy through Mary, and then the genealogy in Luke is his gospel, tripping over my G words today, right? His genealogy in Matthew is his genealogy through Mary, and his genealogy in Luke is his genealogy through Joseph. So the two genealogies are actually very accurate, okay? It's just that one is for his mom and one is for his dad. And the confusion comes in the fact that if you look at the Greek in the Gospel of Matthew, it appears as if it reads that that Jacob begat, this is in verse 16, Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary. And that's not what it's supposed to be. So in Greek, it's a little bit confusing, but in the Aramaic, it's not confusing at all. It is supposed to read, and Jacob begat Joseph, the father of Mary. And it's right there. It's right there in plain Aramaic. Okay. Right there in plain Aramaic that this is Mary's father, not Mary's husband, right? Because it doesn't make any sense. See, because if it's her husband, see, that's when the two genealogies don't make sense together, because if they both come down through Joseph, then they both can't be correct. But if Mary's father's name was Joseph, and one comes through Mary and the other's through Joseph, her husband, then that makes complete sense. So my point here is that we know from the Bible, okay, that Mary's father's name was Joseph, not Joachim. Okay, so sorry, the Protoevangelium of James is wrong. Period. Okay, there's no independent biblical or historical evidence to support the notion that Mary's father and mother were Joachim and Anna. This is it, because because the point of all this, right, is that we have to critically examine our sources. So that's what I'm doing. I am critically examining the Protoevangelium of James, and it is a load of bunk. There's nothing in it that we can accept as being even probable, let alone likely. And a lot of it isn't even possible. So let me burn through this list of some other stuff that we find in the Protoevangelium of James, right? We're told that Joachim and Anna were older and childless, right? Okay, so that has hints of Abraham and Sarah, right? So we're getting this miraculous old age birth thing going again. Now, is that possible? Of course, but it's also pretty convenient that because this is Mary's parents, right? That Mary came about as a result of some type of very special, impossible conception, just like Abraham and Sarah, and just like Zechariah and Elizabeth, right? Okay. But we're told that they were childless and that Joachim was prohibited by the priests from offering sacrifice because he was childless. Now, that's a load of insert your whatever word you want right there, because it would have been the other way around. He would not have been prohibited from offering sacrifice because he was childless. He would have been encouraged to offer sacrifice because he was childless, right? And then, Anna is grieved over the fact that she's childless, so she prays to God to bless her like Sarah. Okay, that's not necessarily wrong, but I want you to try to get a feel for what is likely an agenda here, right? So Anna's prayers are answered by an angelic visitation, right? And so upon hearing the news, she declares that she's going to dedicate her child, whether male or female, to the Lord's service. Oh, well, see, that's pretty convenient. That's right out of the Bible as well. See, so the author is clearly familiar with earlier biblical writings. He's just clearly not a Jew himself, and he's clearly never been to Jerusalem, right? So Anna's conception was in effect miraculous. Okay. According to the Protoevangelium, infant Mary, walked when she was only 6 months old. See, so they're setting up Mary to be special. That Mary was not just a normal Jewish girl from Nazareth. No, 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 no. Mary is somebody special. She's different, right? So, according to the Protoevangelium, Joachim and Anna took Mary to the temple when she was only 3 years old, and that therefore she lived in the temple for a bunch of years, and that she dwelt like a dove and received food from the hand of an angel for 9 years. Okay, right out of the Protoevangelium. Now that's ridiculous. Okay, that's just patently ridiculous that a small female child, would be allowed to live within the temple precincts, right? Okay. Now, under the guidance of another angelic visitation, the high priest assembled the widowers of the people to find her a husband when she was 12 years old. Okay, now that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous as well. And remember, this is in Jerusalem, but when we meet Mary in the Bible, she is from Nazareth. Okay. And yeah, she might be in her mid-teens, and she was recently betrothed to Joseph in that story. Okay. Recently betrothed to Joseph. So this does not line up. This does not line up. Now, that's a super short list. I actually have many, many, many more here. I've actually just kind of run out of time. So so what I'll have to do is I'll have to go through the rest of this list for another episode. But she walks at 6 months old. She lives in the temple. They've got this really bizarre way that Joseph became her husband. We are told that Joseph is older and a widower, that he was previously married, and that he had children by another woman. That's where this tradition comes from. And there is no reason. I'm sorry, folks. I know there's a lot of people out there who are not going to like me for saying this, but there is no reason to believe that's true, because it has no independent factual basis in scripture or history. Okay? Sorry, it just doesn't. So why should we believe this? Okay? The likelihood that Joseph was, a couple, 2, 3 years older than Mary is it. Mary was probably 17 or 18, and Joseph was like 19 or 20. That's the reality of it. Okay? And in the Protoevangelium, she's publicly discovered pregnant, right? Publicly discovered, right? No, she wasn't. She was never publicly discovered. Read the book, okay? She concealed herself, and then Joseph and Mary left Nazareth so that she would not be publicly discovered. So this just goes on and on and on in this document, but this is where the tradition comes from, is from this very specious pseudo-epigraphal document from about 200 AD. This is where it gets started, and then it gets worse, frankly, about 1,000 years later. I've only got a minute or so to tell you this part of the story, but when you fast forward about 1,000 years, you get to Saint Francis of Assisi, okay? And he was probably the first, and if not the first, then he was absolutely one of the first, okay, to do a live nativity scene. Okay. Now, nativity plays were part of the mass prior to St. Francis of Assisi, but St. Francis of Assisi wanted to make it more accessible to the commoners. So he did it outside of the mass, and he did it in a local cave, right? So back in the Protoevangelium, we're told that Jesus is born in a cave. There's no reason to believe he was born in a cave. We are told that he was born in a traditional Judean home in the Bible, right? He wasn't born in a cave. Sorry, wasn't born in a cave. And I know you can go to Jerusalem and have the tour guide show you the cave where he was born. I'm sorry, it's not where he was born. That's not what the Bible says. But at any rate, because St. Francis of Assisi did this live manger scene, now manger scenes exploded across Europe in popularity. And as a result, that is the tradition that we have had for the last 1,000 years, is this notion that there were animals there, and that Jesus was born in a stable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we can actually trace this tradition back through St. Francis of Assisi, all the way back to the Protoevangelium of James. And unfortunately, it's demonstrably false when you compare it with the biblical record. So I have completely run out of time. I've actually gone a little bit over. I really thank you for listening to me today. Again, this is Tim Kies with God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. I'm really glad you listened today. Next week is Christmas Eve, and the Truth Be Told radio network will be playing, here you go, Christmas music at the time that my show is regularly on. So we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks for joining me. All for now.